they didn't let detransitioners be part of the story.
Yeah.
That there was a growing number of these women who were regretting their transition, and they had some, and they were brave enough to speak up, and that took real courage because they're talking about their own experience, their own damage to their own bodies.
Yeah.
I mean, they were the most courageous of all, and they were treated horribly by the activists.
Yeah, it's so dark. Like, you don't want to think that people can make mistakes. Even if you think that people should be allowed to transition when they're young, you don't think that some people are going to do it and regret it? That's insane.
Right.
You think that everybody who goes through surgery to remove parts of their body because they feel like they're in the wrong gender, you think all those people are going to be happy? That's insanity.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a religion in the sense of the fundamentalism of belief against all evidence to the contrary. I mean, these people believed this on faith. It was a creed, and there was no disabusing them of this, even when there was growing evidence of thousands of young women regretting it.
Well, finally now the New York Times is on board, though, which is really interesting.
It is,
and
isn't it?
I saw someone commenting on Twitter, and I think they're probably correct. And they said, this is because the trial lawyers are involved now. And I think they're correct. I think this is why the New York Times has kind of shifted sides, because I think they realize the lawsuits are coming. And once a few of them are successful, and they will be, it's going to get crazy.
Well, I think that is a part of it. But I don't think the lawsuits are going to solve it as easily as they did, say, the repressed memory scandal of prior eras, and the multiple personality disorder, all these people who thought they had repressed memory of various kinds of harm, and were imagining childhood molestation that didn't happen, and put that.
Are you talking about like the satanic stuff from the 80s?
Yeah, from the 80s, that whole satanic. I think that got reversed through lawsuits in part because they weren't following clear medical, clear protocols of their profession. The problem with the gender, going after the gender regime through the courts, and I'm in favor of it, don't get me wrong, but the problem is that the gender therapists, the therapists, the doctors were all following protocol when they transition a kid to, and cut up their bodies in various ways, incapacitated them in various ways. They were actually following affirmative care, which was the official protocol. So which
is crazy.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
It's so crazy that there's so many things that we don't allow children to do because we know that children can't really make lifelong decisions at the age of 11 and 12 and 13, but yet we'll let them in this case.
That's right.
It's so nuts.
Yeah, I when I look back on it, there are a few. I sort of had there were a few sort of lessons of it, but one of the things that really stood out was that almost in every case, there were medical professionals who should have known better, and very often therapists who should have known better, encouraging a young girl who was a little anxious or had some anxiety, had some depression, encouraging her down this road as the solution.
Yeah. But it's also not recognizing what we know about what happens to people when they give them testosterone. So testosterone alleviates anxiety. Testosterone creates a feeling of euphoria.
Right.
It does a lot, especially when you give it to someone in doses that their body would never normally have.
That's right. That's right. And so the girls would go on it and they would feel great and they would become evangelists for testosterone. They would tell all their friends, you got to do this. I feel great. All my anxiety is gone. Of course, now they may have a permanent 5 o'clock shadow.
Yeah. Changing their voice.
Changing their voice.
And when they detransition, that never goes away.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very dark. It's very dark, and I would have never imagined this. I would have never imagined that. Before COVID, I had a completely different opinion of the medical establishment. My opinion of the medical establishment is that they were there to help people. That's
right.
it. I never questioned it. I questioned the motives of some of the pharmaceutical drug companies that were trying to sell drugs. This episode is brought to you by Simply Safe. But I felt like the medical establishment always figured that out eventually, and then they banned those drugs, the ones that were harmful. But that's not real. That's not really what happens. It's a money game. The whole thing's a money and influence game, and it's run by very powerful people. And no one wants to think that those same factors are at play when it comes to gender transition. but, I've shown people the map of gender transition clinics in 2007 versus gender transition clinics in 2023, and it's fucking insane.
Yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah, hundreds and hundreds of new gender clinics all across the country. The industry expanded so rapidly with very little oversight, and it was just how fast could we get these drugs to these kids?
Yeah.
I agree with you. There wasn't enough oversight, but there also weren't enough good people speaking up. A lot of the best doctors who are like, I didn't enter the medical profession to do this. They went silent, or they referred to other. They said, why don't you, let me refer you to a specialist. Well, actually, the gender surgeons often, weren't even, adequate to the task, because it's very, very complicated surgery, involving, transferring peripheral nerves and whatnot. So it's not easy surgery, depending on which surgery you're talking about. Very often, they weren't even the most qualified surgeons doing the surgery. So you had a lot of, surgeries that didn't go quite right.
Well, none of them go quite right. I mean, that's what's dark about it. I mean, you're creating a new thing. Whether you're creating a penis or whether you're turning a penis into a vagina. This is not like heart surgery. This is not something they've been doing forever, that they have this long history of doing it successfully and they know exactly how to do it correctly. The whole thing is very twisted.
Yeah, the rates of, all kinds of things going wrong. I mean, if you talk about the creation of the neophallus, the ones you take a vagina to make something like a penis, the number, getting it to, urine to go in a stream as opposed to a spray, or making it so that the person can have an erection, then a strong enough erection to actually penetrate. These are all require separate surgeries very often. Very often it doesn't go quite right. Then there's all kinds of complications with the surgeries. I mean, I've talked to people who've been really butchered. So
again, what was it like for you? Did you expect, when you wrote that book, did you expect the kind of blowback that you experienced? Like, what did you expect when you wrote the book? Obviously, you felt the need to express this, and you felt the need to share this information because you recognize that there's like this contagion, this social contagion that seems to be happening. It's a big part of what's going on. And a lot of these kids are very easily influenced. A lot of them are on the spectrum, and they're being led down this road. So you write this book. What did you expect was going to be the reaction to it?
Well, most books get very little attention at all. So most books, right, I certainly didn't expect the, massive reaction that I got. I mean, the public campaign to ban me from every possible outlet was so hypercharged, and to some extent, it was successful. I mean, they kept the book on Amazon. It was deleted from Target. You can't find it in a public library in America, no matter how many people try to donate it to their libraries. So to some extent, it was successful. But the campaign to stifle the book, but because I made it onto places like your podcast, because I made it into Amazon, people got it, parents got it. And for the first time, I think parents had another source of information besides the activist narrative of, you're either going to have a live a live son or a dead daughter, or this lie that your child's going to kill themselves if you don't do exactly what I say and let them transition now. This lie was the prevailing narrative, and I think, I was able to break through, and I think that's what made people so angry.
That lie falls apart under scrutiny when you look at the suicide rates of people that are trans.
Right. There's actually a new study out of Finland showing that a really good long-term study, I think it came out maybe just this week, showing that the rates, when you control for other mental health issues, the rates of suicide among those with gender dysphoria, discomfort with the biological sex, the rates of suicide are no higher than for the general population.
That's crazy. Your new book, Bad Therapy: Why Kids Aren't Growing Up.
Yes.
What's wrong with therapy? What are they doing wrong?
They're giving it to kids who aren't sick, who aren't actually struggling with mental illness or disorder. They're giving it to everybody. So what they're doing is they're making existing problems worse, and they're introducing new problems because Therapy has side effects. Just like any intervention that has the power to help, it also has the power to harm.
In what way?
Well, there's a whole body of research on some of the side effects of therapy, and they include things like alienation from spouse, alienation from parents, worsening of depression, worsening of anxiety, feeling of incapacity, feeling like you can't do things without consulting your therapist. All those are well-known iatrogenic effects. Feeling, once you have a mental diagnosis, the labeling, feeling limited by that label. Oh, I have anxiety, I can't. So all those things are well known, what they call iatrogenic effects, meaning whenever a medical procedure actually introduces harm, that's an iatrogenic effect. And we know that, of course, drugs and surgeries always come with, even the life-saving ones can come with some harm. And what people might not know is that therapy comes with these risks as well.
So is this your opinion on therapy in general? Do you think there's a place for therapy?
Absolutely. But I guess the big picture theme here is that therapy with kids and teens is totally different for therapy with an adult, right? An adult sits down. First of all, an adult makes the decision on their own. I really want to work on this. I'm going to go to a therapist. And you get the patient buy-in, and they're ready to do the hard work of therapy. But a child or teenager is usually strong-armed into therapy, so they don't want to be there in the first place. But more importantly, they can't say as easily to a therapist, listen, I don't really think, I think I gave you the wrong impression. I don't think I would call my mom emotionally abusive. Or it's much harder for them to say, listen, I know I was bullied in middle school, but I don't think I have PTSD. It's harder for a kid to say that because they don't have the life experience behind them to know that. And they don't know if they're getting better as easily. An adult can say, I've been seeing this therapist for 3 years. My depression's as bad as it ever was. It's just not working, and move on. Maybe find a different therapist. It's much harder for a teenager to know that.
Yeah, I have never been in therapy, although a lot of people told me I should. But they all are in therapy, and it doesn't seem to be helping. But the people that I know that are in therapy, the ones that are in therapy regularly, are the most fucked up. And I don't see improvement. Maybe it's just a biased sampling of the people that I know that are doing it, but it's the people that, and it's not all of them, but the ones that I find problematic are very self-indulgent. And there's something about going to a therapist and talking about yourself constantly and your problems constantly that sort of reinforces this self-indulgent.
And that's what can lead depression to get worse, sadness to get worse. As you sit and focus on your pain, if you're not careful, especially with teens and kids, it can make the pain, the worry, the feeling of being harmed worse. And I think that's what we're seeing.
But what about the good therapists? Aren't there good therapists that can give you tools to sort of change your patterns of thinking and behavior and move in a positive way?
So if you're struggling with a condition of some sort, a phobia, anorexia, OCD, any number of problems that you want to deal with, therapy can be great. Cognitive behavioral therapy especially can be great. But if you're a teen or kid who shows up bummed out or, just generally kind of anxious, to a therapist, you have a good shot of having that problem made worse.
But why is that? What is it about going to therapy with that problem that's going to make it worse? Because
you're going to sit and talk about your worries regularly. They're not going to say, that exercise is amazing for depression. Study after study. In fact, there have been recent studies showing it's better than antidepressants for a lot of,
1.25%.
It's amazing, right? 1
1.25, 1 times better.
Right.
Yeah.
Dancing is apparently amazing for, low mood. Now, I'm not talking about severe major depressive disorder, okay? When you have severe chronic depression, you may need to treat it with medication or therapy. But for low mood, sort of mild to moderate depression, exercise turns out to be better, and it doesn't have those side effects.
Yeah.
But let me give you an example of a teenager I talked to. So I talked to this girl, Becca, is what I call her in the book. But she was a high school senior, and she had been in therapy since age 6, okay, when her parents divorced. She didn't have any diagnosed mental disorder of any kind. But she had regularly been in therapy because her parents divorced and they said, you got to go to therapy. So I asked her as a high school senior, so what are you working on with your therapist now? And she said to me, my therapist is getting me ready to make friends in college. She's helping me.
Oh, boy.
So we're rehearsing, we're going through my past experiences and we're talking about how to get me ready to make friends in college.
It gives me anxiety just thinking about
Right.
it. Someone coaching me to go make friends is like, what?
Right. Do you see, this generation feels that it can't do because they've gotten so much oversight and so much needless mental health intervention that they're questioning themselves all the time. They're in their heads all the time.
And what motivated you to write this book? Like, do you have personal experiences with people that are going through this?
Well, two things. Like, one is I'm raising 3 kids in this generation. So I wanted to know, like, why was the generation that got the most mental health intervention, the most therapy, the most psych meds, the most interventions in schools, the most therapeutic parenting, why were they in the most distress? And why were they so afraid to grow up? And we shouldn't see that. They should be the picture of wellness. Nobody worried about anybody's mental health more than we worried about their mental health. And yet they're the picture of despair. So I really wanted to know, like, what was going on with them. And also, of course, I had written Irreversible Damage, and I knew from that, experience that very often when a young woman would tell a story about when her life went desperately off track, it was with a therapist. And here's the thing, it wasn't necessarily a gender therapist. Most often, it was just your vanilla psychodynamic therapist who was there to talk to an anxious or a little bummed out teen, mildly depressed teen about their bad feelings. And lo and behold, during the course of, regular psychodynamic therapy, they would say, and what are your feelings on gender? And with the therapist, they would go down that route.
Wow. There's a lot of other factors too, right, that's contributing to kids' anxiety today, and a big one has to be social media.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Social media is a huge part of the story. There's no question. I wrote about it in the first book, and, Jonathan Haidt, Jean Twenge have been talking about it for 8 years now, and they've brought rigor and important research to show that has, extracting kids from their social world is bad.
Yeah.
And getting them, making them, getting the dopamine hit, and the anxious, worry about who's going to write me back and when, and then getting the dopamine hit when they get that response, and that whole cycle. There's no question that plays on our natural sort of, propensities for addiction, and makes kids more anxious. But I think it's part of what we're seeing. I don't think it's the whole story. And the reason I don't think it's the whole story is a few things. First of all, childhood mental health and adolescent mental health has been in precipitous decline in this country since the 1950s. So,
and how do they measure that?
So from, let's say, by every measure, by the way, but let's say take between 1955 and 1988, the rates of adolescent suicide quadrupled. So that's just one measure, but there are many. I mean, we've seen it from non-suicidal self-harm, suicidal self-harm. All of these rates have gone up for adolescents, but they've been in decline for mental health in this, of teens has been in decline for years. There's also some other statistics or some other reasons I don't think phones explain the whole story. One of them is that in 2016, the CDC came out with a report, and they said that 1 in 6 kids between the ages of 2 and 8, these aren't kids with smartphones, between the ages of 2 and 8, 1 in 6 kids had a mental health or behavioral diagnosis. That's a lot of kids. That's a lot of kids with a mental health diagnosis, right?
Do you think that a factor is parents with mental health issues? And there's, I think, more adults are anxious. More adults are suffering from anxiety and depression, at least diagnosed anxiety and depression, now than ever before.
I think adults are absolutely passing on their anxiety to their kids. And that actually we're seeing that in, Jean Twenge came out with this book, Generations. And one of the things she said in it is that boys, even though teenage girls have the worst mental health in general, boys from liberal families had worse mental health than girls from conservative families in terms of anxiety and depression. So why should that be? We know the girls are on social media more, right? Mm-hmm. Boys, that's not their thing, right? They're into video games or whatever. But I think part of the reason is what you said. There are certain families that are passing on anxiety about things like climate change. But I also think it shows that it's in the environment we're giving them. We're not giving kids a healthy life, right? We think that we can give them an unhealthy life and just pour in the mental health resources and remediate. But it doesn't work like that. And then the last reason I don't think that phones totally explain everything or social media is because they're in societies where they use just as much social media. It's not great for the kids' mental health, no doubt, but they have much better rates of anxiety and depression than we do. Countries like Japan and Israel, where kids have more independence, they have more freedom, they're able to take more risks on their own, and they walk home from school. They do all kinds of jobs outside of the house, like run errands for the family, and they get a feeling of, first of all, short-term joy and long-term satisfaction from being able to take risks, see what they can handle, but also a feeling of efficacy in the world.
So that's an interesting statistic that you were saying that. So conservative families have less depressed kids? Is that what you're saying?
Apparently, boys from liberal families have higher anxiety rates than girls from conservative families.
But above, if you just looked at the norm, more girls generally have anxiety.
Right.
But in conservative families, girls are less anxious than boys from liberal families.
That's right. And, I mean, we could speculate as to why. There are lots of proposed reasons for that. But one of the many, things that we might, first of all, we know it's in the environment at that point. It's not an organic, whatever these kids are going through, it's not organic, right? So we know it's something we're pouring into their life. And I think one of the things might be that, aside from the fact that parents in conservative families may be more comfortable asserting their authority with kids, and that's an old finding. We've known for generations now that authoritative parenting meaning not cold parenting, not cruel, not unloving.
Rules.
But rules. Those kids have better mental health, they're happier, and they're more successful in all kinds of ways. So it may be something to do with comfort with rules, but also they're less likely to turn their kids' lives over to a mental health expert.
So what is the speculation as to why rules alleviate anxiety? Is it because there's structure? There's more structure to the world, so things seem less open-ended and less chaotic?
That's right. I think it's something to do with that. Kids need guardrails. They know they're not ready to be in charge. Parents today are so quick to put kids in charge. What do you want? Where would you like to go to school? What would you like to eat for dinner? Putting kids in charge. But we've known since the 1960s. Diana Baumrin did this research years ago, and it's some of the sturdiest research we have because they've replicated it hundreds of times. And they've shown that loving parents who are also rule-bound, they call them authoritative, not authoritarian, which is the cold, unloving rule-bound, but the loving and rule-bound parents tend to raise the happiest kids because kids knows there are guardrails. And here's the thing. The people who are making the rules aren't some expert mom hired. They're the people who love me most. They're my parents. They're the ones in charge. I think that's really comforting to kids.
That's interesting because that's not what people think of when they think of authoritarian or authoritative parents.
Right.
They think of parents that are restricting their children and the children are going to rebel.
That's right. I mean, there's a lot of really good research on this, but it actually doesn't create more rebellious kids. By virtually every metric, they do much better in all kinds of circumstances and in all kinds of situations. And what they used to have was permissive parents and authoritarian parents. Those were the other two extremes. Permissive parents let kids do whatever they wanted, and authoritarian parents, said obey at all costs, and they were fairly cold. And their kids didn't end up great in terms of mental health. But today we don't even have permissive parents in my view. I think we have something even worse. We have permissive parents who are therapeutic, meaning they're always asking kids what they want, but they're never asserting their authority, but they're doing something else. They're hovering and surveilling their kids. And so it's permissive without the independence.
Yeah. That's a weird one, right? Like the snap maps and stuff where you're following your kids everywhere on Snapchat.
They're surveilling them. These kids have no independence. They have no space from mom or dad, and it's not doing them any good.
This episode is brought to you by Simply Safe.